Welcome, everybody. Welcome to another City Club Friday program. I'm Doug Marker, president of the City Club, and our forum today is the economy, Oregon and beyond, one small state in a big, flat world. Just a reminder, please, to turn off cell phones and other electronic devices, and I have a few announcements. Next Friday's forum is Mayor Tom Potter will be here for the 2006 State of the City Address, and we have already sold out for the program. If you've called to reserve your seat but not paid, please do so to keep the lines at the reservation table to a minimum. You can call the office to pay by phone, or you can pay on your way out of today's program. Upcoming member-led programs include our Education and Human Development Issue Committee meeting next Tuesday, January 17th at noon at City Club Commons. The guest speaker is Deborah Cochran, director of the Portland Teachers Program. Deborah will discuss a collaborative effort to increase the number of teachers from historically underrepresented groups in the teaching profession. The Arts and Culture Issue Committee will be meeting at 12 noon on Thursday, January 19th, also at the City Club Commons, to examine the emergence of graphic novels and comics as literary forms. The panelists are Brett Warnock, Colleen Coover, and Diane Schutz. Our next Final Friday open house will be held from 4:30 to 6 p.m. on Friday, January 27th at the City Club Commons. Our sponsors this quarter are McEwen Gisvold LLP and Medico Support Services of the Northwest Incorporated. Our sponsors make broadcast of the City Club possible, and so would you join me in thanking them? To our program. Every January, the City Club discusses the prospects for Oregon's economy in the coming year. In 2006, we know that Oregon employment numbers are up. The Dow Jones Index is now trading back at levels from before September 11th, and the economy seems to be on a rebound. But in recent City Club programs, we've heard warnings. Hurricane Katrina and the war in Iraq pressured the nation's economy in 2005. Budget and trade deficits continue to grow. We have reason to be nervous. Our state economist, Tom Potiowsky, joins us again to provide a forecast for Oregon's economy in 2006. Tom is on leave from Portland State University to serve in the Office of Economic Analysis in the Department of General Services. In that role, Tom is responsible for providing forecasts for the state's general fund revenue. We asked two other prominent Oregon economists to join Tom for this discussion. Kimberly Clausing teaches economics at Reed College. Dr. Clausing studies the taxation of multinational corporations. She can speak to the decisions that international companies make in locating their operations and how Oregon is situated in the increasingly global economy. Also joining us is Mary King, chair of the Economics Department of Portland State University. Dr. King studies race and gender in the workforce and can address what Oregon's changing economy means for workers and the labor market. So with that, I'll let our panel get started. Tom?
Thank you, Doug. I want to thank you for inviting me once again to address the City Club of Portland. You have a rich history here of civic responsibility to Portland and the state of Oregon, and it's a privilege to address you today. Well, the current economic expansion has been underway since early 2002, and it would take until June of 2003 before we saw job gains in this economy. Unemployment peaked at 8.5% during the recession and is now down to 5.8% in November, the lowest rate we've seen since really the year 2000. This Tuesday, the Employment Department for the state releases the December numbers. So as of November, we're still down below 6%. The non-farm employment in Oregon now stands at an all-time high. All sectors have new high employment levels except for professional and business services and the manufacturing sector. Now, while manufacturing's only regained about 44% of the jobs that it lost during the recession, it still is the fourth fastest job gaining sector among the 50 states. And this is just an indication of sort of the deep hole that this sector has to climb out of. Oregon also has the paradoxical situation of having one of the highest unemployment rates in the nation, coupled with one of the highest job growth rates in the nation. Now, part of the answer to this puzzle really is population growth. Oregon, whether real or perceived, has an intrinsic quality of life that draws people into the state. And with economic recovery well underway today, the in-migration numbers are even growing faster. Now, what this means is that this should keep Oregon's unemployment rate above the average for the nation, even as we expand forward. Now, one disturbing characteristic of this recovery harks back to the economic recovery of the early 1980s. The 1980-82 recessionary period had devastating consequences for Oregon's wood products industry. High-paying jobs disappeared and newly created jobs were at lower wages. And our state per capita income didn't really pick up until later in the 1980s, when high-paying tech jobs came onto the scene. A similar but less dramatic effect is being played out in today's recovery. Even though Oregon's economy has an all-new time high for employment, surpassing our previous peak of November of 2000, the average wages of the jobs gained are below the average wages of those jobs lost. Our per capita personal income relative to the U.S. average is about as low as in the early and mid-1980s. Now, the situation is not as dramatic, as I said, as back in the early 1980s, but the situation is similar and I think quite disturbing. Average wages, though, are now running about the same level of inflation, and as the economy continues to expand, we expect this trend to continue to improve. It's just disturbing that it's taken so long for wages just simply to catch up for inflation. And that means that average wages, you're still going to find certain sectors of the economy where the wages are running ahead of inflation. There's also certain jobs where their wages are still running below inflation, and thus their real wages are falling. Job growth in 2005, when all the data comes in, we'll get the data this Tuesday, will most likely be above 3.2% growth for jobs. That's the fastest yearly job growth since 1997, so almost 8 years ago. My office is forecasting positive but slower growth for 2006 and 2007. Reasoning for this lies in several areas. The national economy is expected to slow in the coming years, and as our other speakers today will highlight, the Oregon economy will most likely follow suit as to what happens both nationally and internationally in terms of economic conditions. Now, we're approaching the more mature stages of the business cycle. In the early stages of recovery, businesses have excess capacity, they can add workers at a very strong pace. But as businesses reach capacity constraints, they need to expand before they can take on new workers. And as job markets get tighter, skilled workers become tougher to find. All this leads to a slower growth job scenario. Thus, for the next 2 years, we envision the Oregon economy to continue to expand at slower rates compared to last year. Job growth should be slightly below 2% in 2006 and around 1.5% in 2007. Now, I'm just going to touch on a few sectors of what we may expect, we think, in the next 2 years. Now, the best employment data that we use is referred to as the non-farm payroll employment. Now, the employment numbers that come out of our agricultural sector, they generally come with a lag, they're delayed, and they're kind of tough to verify. But still, the agricultural sector is really still a very important sector for the Oregon economy. Now, as the data becomes available, we think 2005 is going to turn out to be a little bit of a tougher year for agriculture than 2004 were. Export value of agricultural products was 7% lower in the first 3 quarters of 2005 compared to the similar period a year ago. The U.S. dollar also reversed trend in 2005 and appreciated against most other currencies. This makes Oregon agricultural products more expensive overseas. Now, the next 2 years should bring a little better times to the agricultural sector. Projections point to stronger growth of our trading partners, so they should increase their imports of Oregon agricultural products. And there's also projection for a decline in the value of the U.S. dollar. Energy expenses still loom as a risk for this sector, and I'm going to address some of those risks a little bit later. The construction sector will likely top 10% job growth for 2005, definitely the strongest of all our job sectors that we track. Over the next 2 years, job growth should slow along with a slowing housing market. We expect the non-residential side for construction to help employment in this area, along with public projects such as bridges and roads. Now, for the computer electronics manufacturing sector, that sort of narrow definition of high tech, they've been adding jobs through the recovery, but they've had a little bit of a soft patch in 2005. We project very little change from this situation as this sector faces fierce competition and continues to strive to contain costs to remain competitive. In our wood products industry, this is usually called one of our traditional industries, but it could easily today be classified as a high-tech industry. The wood products has seen strong increase in demand for its products, the strongest demand, I'd say, in over 20 years. Even with this strong demand, job growth has just been above 2%, and that's actually the best it's seen also in ages. But like nothing compared like the growth we've seen in construction. So this sector has now become a high-tech sector. It is very efficient, very productive, and it's able to produce more products with very little additional labor. As the housing market is expected to slow, we also expect this sector to slow. Retailers have discovered Oregon. We're going through one of the largest expansion periods that we've seen in a long time. From big box to orange crate stores, retailing has added jobs throughout 2005. We expect this pace to slow considerably in the next 2 years, and so will the job growth in this sector. Lastly, the government sector will increase its hiring as budgets improve. Local education employment will slowly add jobs lost during 2003, but the demographics still point to a slight lowering of the school-age population over the next 2 years, so we think increases in this area will be rather modest. Now, for the short term then, the Oregon economy should continue to grow, but at a slower pace. Two obstacles stand as risks to this outlook, among many other obstacles, but I think these are the two main ones, and that's the housing market and the energy market. The housing market has been responsible for a good amount of the growth in the Oregon economy in the past few years. With rising mortgage rates and rapidly rising home prices, the threat of this activity going away is quite real. We project a slowing in the housing market, maybe even a retreat in prices, but nothing of the magnitude that would crush this market. Housing starts should come down to levels that will still employ a good number of people directly and indirectly related to this industry. On the energy front, oil prices are settling down, though they're still quite high. Barring geopolitical disruptions, oil prices should continue to soften into 2006, but don't look for the low-cost years that we had in the late 1990s. The outlook next year for natural gas is, I think, a little less promising. With natural gas prices at the wellhead now around 78% higher than the cost of gas just this past fall, the prospects for 30 to 50% price increases for residences and businesses come this October 2006 are very possible. Now, I want to keep in mind, this is a forecast, it's projected risk, not a reality. If natural gas prices retreat come this summer, price increases could be much lower. In fact, just today, the price at the what's called the Henry Hub came in below $10. So that's considerably less than the sort of $14, $15 we were just seeing in December. So it's very possible, as I said, we may not see the big increases that could possibly happen in this sector. But it's a risk that we have to be careful of. Beyond 2006, those prospects for greater natural gas supplies are very excellent, and we should see lower prices in the future. Now, our topic today also addresses the ability of a relatively small state like Oregon to influence its economic destiny. I'll only touch on this briefly as we have two highly respected experts on our panel today. On Monday, during the Oregon Business Plan Conference at the Convention Center, we heard an address from Dr. Michael Porter. And Dr. Michael Porter of Harvard stated that Oregon needed to address two areas to help it maintain a competitive advantage in the world economy. First, he pointed out that the mix of industry and business clusters in Oregon are not necessarily the wrong mix, but they're not fully developed to give us a unique competitive advantage. Second, he recommended supporting a top-rated research university. Well, the state has embarked on strategies in these directions. The Oregon Nanoscience and Microtechnologies Institute, ONAMI, in collaboration with three major universities, maybe I should just say the three universities, I don't want to offend anybody, the three universities with the highest enrollment, in collaboration along with the Pacific Northwest National Laboratory out of Richmond, Washington, the Oregon Health and Science Universities, and a cluster of high-tech firms of their Silicon Forest in Southwest Washington. This institute really leverages the state-of-the-art manufacturing research in these areas. And really assisting with places like Intel, Hewlett-Packard, along with university research such as Portland State's microscopy facility. The state's also addressing accessibility issues to higher education and the education and needs of workers at large. The state will implement one of the largest increases in tuition aid for higher education, adding part-time students for the first time, which is especially useful for a diverse student population like Portland State University. Also, a reorientation on education that recognizes the coming skilled labor gaps in the wood products, agricultural, and machinery industries. Now, one last piece that I think the state can help out on in assisting our economy is to have a stable funding source for education, social services, and public safety. It is no secret that our state tax revenue system is very volatile and I speak from experience, difficult to forecast. We badly need a full-blown rainy day fund. But this is no easy task. This is especially so because of Oregon's kicker law. You know, we do not put aside the tax revenues in the good times. They are returned to households and businesses anytime the revenues over 2 years come in 2% or higher compared to the forecast. Now, the original purpose of the kicker was to control state government spending. You know, this reminds me of the medication commercials I see on TV. You know, the kicker will control government spending, but it has side effects. You know, just like a pill that lowers cholesterol but could lead to blindness, brain tumors, and loss of liver function. Cholesterol is the least of your worries. You know, the kicker has side effects that prevent the building of rainy day funds and delays the recovery out of recessions. The corporate kicker in particular is related to an extremely volatile sector where the vast majority of kicker refunds go to multi-state corporations. There is no evidence that the majority of corporate kickers are retained in Oregon. There is no evidence that the corporate kicker has been a determining factor for businesses to locate in Oregon or to prevent existing businesses from leaving Oregon. In its 25-year history, the corporate kicker has proven its worth. In scientific economic terminology, it's a loser. Get rid of it. You know, there are a lot of other better prescriptions for controlling state government than through the kicker, and we should be investigating those. In summary, the Oregon economy is going to continue to expand the next 2 years, but at a slower pace. Oregon and the national economy has taken a number of hits from the geopolitical arena, energy, and natural catastrophes, yet continues to move forward. So if our Teflon shell holds up and the worst of these risks do not materialize, we can definitely see the economy continue to grow, I'd say, over these next 2 years. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's an honor to be here today. Normally when I speak on this topic, I'm given about a semester. Today I have eight minutes, so I'm going to get straight to the point. My work looks at how multinational firms respond to tax incentives, and what I'll do today is give you some of the most important lessons from that work, and also share what we can and cannot learn for Oregon's policymakers about those effects. The reason to focus on multinational firms is because they play a really huge role in the economy, both nationwide and in Oregon as well. Multinational firms in the United States employ tens of millions of people. They employ them in really the best jobs, the jobs that earn higher wages, the jobs that are more likely to come with health insurance. And these firms do a disproportionate amount of research and development, and the sheer amount of economic activity that they do is really quite large, over $6 trillion of sales in the United States. So it's important to understand how the tax system affects these firms. The U.S. tax system gives multinational firms a large incentive to earn income, as it turns out, in low-tax countries rather than in the United States. And this incentive is provided by taxing that foreign income in low-tax countries more lightly than regular U.S. incomes. Now, firms can respond to these incentives in two different ways. They can take real actions and they can take financial actions. A real action is something like doing less investment in a high-tax place or having fewer jobs in a high-tax place rather than a low-tax place. A financial response is more like doing whatever you were going to do anyway, but just making sure that the income is booked in the low-tax location rather than the high-tax location. Now, the evidence suggests that firms are responsive in both of these ways. They respond in real ways and they respond in financial ways. But they respond much more financially than they do in a real way. One piece of evidence that might help convince you of that is just to look at where U.S. multinational firms have their jobs. Where are the jobs throughout the world? 7 out of 10 of the top 10 job locations are other countries that look a lot in many ways like the United States. They're rich countries with rich people, with a large role for government, relatively large, often larger than ours, and that also have high wages, relatively more regulated economies. So these are countries like the UK, Germany, France, Italy, Japan, Australia, and Canada are 7 out of the top 10. Only 2 of the top 10 employment countries, 3 of the top 10 employment countries are poor countries: Mexico, Brazil, and China. And 2 of those 3 have tax rates that exceed that in the US. China's tax rate is actually lower than ours, but not so low as to really make them a tax haven. So while real responses to taxes are important for jobs, they're likely dominated by other things, by multinational firms' desire to be near big markets with rich customers. Now, financial responsiveness is another matter. If you look where the US multinational firms earn their income, 6 of the top 10 countries are tax havens, or countries with tax rates lower than 10%, is how I define them. Ireland, Bermuda, Netherlands, Luxembourg, Switzerland, and Singapore. If you look at those countries, they're small economies that you don't necessarily want to do a lot of activity in those countries, but together they account for over 70% of all foreign profits of US multinational firms. That pretty much tells you that the financial responsiveness is very dominant here. Just take Ireland as an example. Over 10% of all foreign profits of US multinational firms are earned in Ireland. You know, a little island. I mean, there are some jobs there, right? But the jobs are less than 1% of employment. But the profits are more than 10% of profits. So surely something is going on there. And I gave a talk similar to this in Ireland about a year ago. They gave me 40 minutes, by the way. And it's clear that the people in Ireland and the government officials are quite worried about potential reversals in U.S. tax law that would discourage the kind of behavior that they've benefited from so far. And particularly in light of the 2004 presidential campaign, when John Kerry spent a lot of time talking about offshoring and the tax incentives that encourage offshoring. Fortunately, they need not worry, I guess fortunately for the Irish, because in October 2004, the Congress of the United States passed the American Jobs Creation Act, which actually provides, on net, an incentive to do more activity in low-tax countries by giving a tax holiday to firms that have accumulated a lot of profits in these countries. So I like to sort of joke that the American Jobs Creation Act, which is 650 pages, most of which create new loopholes, is actually a Jobs Creation Act for accountants and lawyers. So hopefully there are some of you in the audience who are benefiting from that. The lesson, I think, of all of this research is that both firms and individuals respond much more in financial ways than in real ways to tax incentives. And this is important for policy implications, but just think about it for yourself. I mean, if you think, many of you probably have a lot of home equity debt, partly because the tax system encourages you to have home equity debt. And this is one way that you alter your finances to minimize your tax obligation. This doesn't mean you're a bad person or anything. It just means that you're paying attention to the tax law, right? But very few of you probably are working less hard because of taxes or doing less entrepreneurial activity, even though you make sure that the activities that you do are done in a way that reduces your tax burden. And firms are very much similar in that respect. So this means for the policymakers that focusing on the tax rate is perhaps less important than focusing on the tax system, making sure the tax system is one that is relatively simple, that is relatively easy to comply with, that's easy to administer, and easy to enforce. Because if you have a relatively simple, enforceable, administratable tax system, then you can collect more revenue at in fact, a lower rate and discourage the sorts of financial shenanigans that lead to 10% of worldwide profits occurring in Ireland. So I think that's an important lesson for tax policymakers. Now, turning to the state of Oregon, I would argue that these sorts of tax incentives are in two respects much less important at the state level than they are at the international level. First of all, there's a lot less variation at the state level in tax rates. If you look among countries, you can choose among investment locations that vary between a 0% tax rate and an excess of 50% tax rate. Among states, there is not so much choice. 42 of the 50 states have corporate income tax rates that are within 5 percentage points of each other. Oregon's rate, by the way, is just slightly less than the national average. So for that reason, the variation is less important. But also, firms are not able to shift income among states the way they shift it among countries. When the IRS asks Intel, for example, how much money did they earn in the United States? Well, Intel gets to determine, financially speaking, how much income is booked in the United States versus other countries. They don't get to do that with respect to how much is earned in Oregon with respect to other states, because what all states do is they apportion the income that's earned nationwide to individual states based on a formula. So the only way they can change how much income ends up being Oregon income is to effectively change how much activity they're doing here. But the financial shenanigans won't help them in that regard. So I would argue that these types of incentives are less important at the state level, so long as you're not completely out of whack with what other states are doing. Now, what does matter at the state level is likely other aspects of the investment climate. The bigger states with more networks and agglomeration effects are going to attract more activity, but there are also other things that local and state policymakers can do to make an attractive investment climate. And I think one of the most important things for Oregon policymakers to think about in this regard is the education policy, which relates to having a stable source of funding, but also to try to attempt to have strong schools that we can be proud of right here in Oregon. If you look at the statistics, it's kind of discouraging. In terms of fourth grade reading, Oregon ranks 33 out of 50 states. In terms of fourth grade math, Oregon ranks 28 out of 50 states. I think we could stand to, on test scores, I think we could stand to try to invest in education more to try to improve the investment climate. And this would help both firms, because they would have good workers and smart people located here in Oregon that they could rely on, but it would also help attract and keep people who are the entrepreneurial, innovative types that will generate the new firms for tomorrow. The multinational firms that don't exist yet, that are still ideas in people's head. You want those people to be in Oregon, and they're going to be more happy being in Oregon if their children can go to well-funded and able public schools. So hopefully Mary will talk a little bit about that with her labor force stuff. Thank you.
Hello. Wave at me if I'm loud. Academics are used to projecting, so I'll tone it down. But I'm very pleased to be invited here today. Thank you for this honor and for your engagement with these crucial issues. I want to take a bit of time to review some of the trends we might worry more about, and a little more time to think about what we can do about them in, as our conveners put it, a small state in a big flat world. We often think of the economy as something that happens to us, kind of like the weather. But we really have quite an ability to affect it. It's a human creation. We can influence it. What's more, Oregon is as big as a small country. We may feel like a backwoods outpost far from the centers of power, but our population of 3.5 million is as big or bigger than each of the Baltic states. We're 2/3 the size of Finland. We're half the size of Israel. And we don't have to administer our own military and foreign policy. We get to pay for it. We might like more say over it, but that's a whole nother topic. When you look at places by rankings of the standard of living, small nations are right up there at the very top, particularly the Scandinavian countries of Finland, Norway, and Sweden. They dominate all the measures of comparative well-being, such as the UN's Human Development Index, Prescott-Allen's Human Well-Being Index, measures of life expectancy, and the like. Now, I know somebody's going to say, yeah, what about suicide? So I went and looked that up. Sweden's suicide rate is actually 29th in the world. It's well behind countries that we never think about in this regard, like Switzerland and Japan. Who knew? What's more, small countries like the Scandinavian ones have been dealing with strong foreign competition for decades. And you'll notice they've never felt the need to beat the lowest wage competitor. Volvo competes, but not on wages. IKEA competes, but not on wages. Nokia competes, but not on wages. So Lutefisk doesn't compete, but you can't have everything, you know. The Scandinavians also don't say they can't afford education, healthcare, and social services. And one reason is that when you go to look at the numbers, as one well-known Scandinavian scholar, Gösta Esping Andersson, has, it turns out that we pay just as high a proportion of our GDP as the Swedes do for social expenditures, including healthcare, childcare, and education. But we do it privately and inefficiently, so that many people are left out of the healthcare system, the quality and turnover in our childcare system is poor, and our students come out of college with enormous loans to pay off. But we pay just as much as the Swedes do for this. Not only that, Sweden's rates of economic and productivity growth are at least as good as anybody else's, including ours, over the last several decades. This was recently demonstrated by Peter Lindert, an economist at UC Davis, who starts his book with just a wonderful quote, something along the lines of, "It's widely known that expensive social services will drag down your economy." It's widely known, but absolutely false. The Scandinavian strategy is to include people so that everyone gets a good start in life. Parents can afford to stay home with their kids when they're young, and then they can afford to put them in high-quality childcare when they go back to work. The rate of child poverty in Scandinavian countries really puts us to shame. Now, this might sound like a picky academic point when I'm supposed to be talking to you about how we're going to compete in a big flat world, but it's not. It's really central. There is no single better indicator of future social marginalization than child poverty. And what I mean by social marginalization is that you'll drop out of school, you'll go to jail, you'll end up on welfare, you'll get your health care from charity sources or not at all, and you'll pay no taxes. To put it really coldly and bluntly, you'll be a drain on society and cost everybody else money. Now, our rates of child poverty are an international scandal. Many people don't realize that our overall poverty rates are the highest among all of the affluent countries, including all of the European countries, Canada, Australia, Japan, etc. We may be the richest country in the world by some measures, but our poverty rates are the very highest in this group, and our rates of child poverty and extreme poverty are by far the worst of the advanced economies. Our child poverty rates are above 20%. More than 1 in 5 kids live in households with incomes below the official poverty line, which most researchers will tell you they think is too low, so the real numbers are higher. Everybody else is doing a better job at bringing these numbers down. Just to pick one example, child poverty in Germany, one of our biggest economic competitors and a country struggling to incorporate Eastern Germany, has child poverty rates below 7%. That's less than a third of ours. And of course, the Scandinavians, who obviously ought to have me on the payroll because I'm shilling for them, have child poverty rates that range from a low of 2.8% in Finland to a high of 4.2% in Sweden, compared with ours over 20%. Now, it's not true that other countries' economies, that their markets, produce fewer low-income people than ours do. That's not what it is. If you look at the work of international poverty researchers, and among them Timothy Smeating is really the leader, you'll see that our economy produces about the same amount of poverty as do all the rest of the wealthy market economies. Maybe we even produce a little bit less because women work so much in this country as compared to some of the others. But we do far less to ameliorate the poverty our economy creates, and that makes all the difference. So I want to urge you today, as Oregonians, to think of ourselves as a small country in a league with a sometimes obstreperous federation of states, because there's a lot we can do at the state level to improve standards of living here. And we've made some good starts with the Oregon Health Plan, by indexing the minimum wage to inflation. We were out in front on mandated parental leave and the more positive aspects of welfare reform, and we used to fund our schools well. We can go further. The biggest problems that we face in the labor market now are growing inequality, and I know you all are thinking about that with the consequences for civil society, low wages, which is particularly felt by young people, including young parents, the high school educated, women, minority communities. 3, declining health and pension coverage in the private sector. 4, pockets of unemployment, especially in rural areas and minority communities. And of course, poverty, particularly child poverty. To this, let me add one more that we too often overlook: the unprecedented incarceration rates that we have now as a result of our failed budget-busting war on drugs policies. This country now incarcerates more people than any other nation for which we have the numbers. We incarcerate more people than Russia, more than South Africa, 5 times as many as England, 10 times as many as Sweden, and 2.5 times as many as we ourselves did only 25 years ago in 1980. This strategy is expensive, and it doesn't work. All of these people are coming back to our communities, and they're coming back without educations, without job skills, and without work experience. But we can do something about this. We can work effectively at the state level to fight each of these 6 problems and to improve our standards of living. And we can start with funding our schools, investing in early childhood education. There's no better investment than funding Head Start for fighting the effects of child poverty. We can keep developing apprenticeship and training programs, especially kids who are coming out of high school and not going on to college. We can expand the Oregon Health Plan. We can bring criminal sentencing at the state level back to a reasonable level. We can keep the minimum wage indexed to inflation. We can continue to require that businesses who work with government agencies pay a living wage, and we can support higher education, just for a start. What we cannot do is continue to accept the arguments that we can't afford the kind of policies that reduce child poverty, raise wages at the bottom, and diminish inequality. In fact, I would argue the exact opposite. We can't afford not to implement these kinds of policies. If you look around the country, the successful states are not the ones with the lowest wages, taxes, and government expenditures. If that were true, Mississippi would be leading the economy, and New York and California would be dragging behind. But it's exactly the opposite. Thank you.
We'll now open the floor to questions. We've got the microphones on both sides of the room. Questions are a privilege for City Club members only. And our first question will come from our board host, Corleen Kraft. Corleen, of course, is our immediate past president, and she's a broker for the Hassan Company, specializing in residential real estate. Corleen?
Thank you. Well, that was so interesting, and they answered so many questions. I don't know if I can even come up with a good one, so I'm seeing big lines back there, which is helpful. But thinking about some of our past speakers, thinking back to James Garrison, who talked about America's empire, and he was not very sanguine about where we're headed. We had Mr. Walker, who's the Comptroller General, a couple of weeks ago, and he talked about the dire consequences that are going to ensue if we don't get our entitlement programs taken care of. And then, of course, Dr. John Kitzhaber's plan to bring it home to Oregon, as he did with the Oregon Health Plan, to try to change the Medicare-Medicaid system. And without those things, without that being taken care of, is it possible to get money for these other programs, for social services, for example, and the big emphasis is on education. Everything that I read, and I think all of you have said, education is the key. Is that plan workable to cut that back, such as Dr. Kitzhaber is suggesting? And if we don't, at a state level or at a federal level, how can we deal with it?
I didn't exactly understand what you meant when you said.
Where are we going to get the money if we cannot take, if the entitlement programs are so big that we can't have sufficient funds at either the federal or the state level? How are we going to find the money to deal with these other problems?
Do you want to start first, or shall I? Well, I think it's interesting that we now can't afford things we could afford throughout our entire history. You know, when we think about the great generation of World War II and what they paid for those of us who were in the schools, we had art, we had PE, we had all these kinds of things. So I think the framing of the question is at a start odd. Why at this point can we no longer afford to do this kind of thing? Then second, should we look directly to fund it? I think you start to look at the tax structure and how we've shifted the tax burden in ways that are not that productive that we need to re-look at. There are some very concrete kinds of things we can think about. For instance, right now our property tax doesn't include intangible property, but it's not hard to think about taxing property from stocks and bonds and finances and that kind of thing. So I think, you know, the question is framed as if we were poor, which we're not. I think with a will to pay for these things, it's not difficult. That's my feeling.
I think federally there are three issues that are really driving our inability to pay for things, and two of them we can do something about, one of them we're stuck with. On the demographic side, we're stuck with a big bunch of old people coming down the pipeline, and once you have all those old people and you have Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid, it's going to be expensive no matter how you look at it. That's the thing we can't do anything about, aside from maybe letting in some more immigrants to increase the workforce to population, you know, to retiree ratio. That would be one solution. But we can do something about the tax structure. We've had a lot of tax cuts of late at the federal level that weren't really justified and that we don't need to keep, you know, so we could reverse that. And also on the spending side, I'm not sure that the allocation of spending is necessarily optimal. I mean, we're already involved in a lot of conflicts that we need to wrap up, but hopefully once we get to that point, we could do less spending in that area and more in some of the social areas, I think, at the federal level.
I think just to echo both Mary and Kim's comments, you know, at our state level, we did go down a road where, you know, and no one really likes to pay taxes, but we like to have the services that government provides. We decided that we've had property taxes that were too high, but we didn't want to cut educational services, so we transferred most of the responsibility over to the state governments to fund it. And we moved from a rather stable funding source like property taxes to an unstable, volatile source like income taxes and corporate taxes. At the same time, we also collectively voted in to get tougher on crime, you know, and with the 3 strikes you're out type mentality, and the public safety budget also ballooned. And so just as Colleen is saying, these sort of what's becoming sort of entitlement programs are very tough to change course. But I think as Mary was stating, we need to really take a serious look at our correctional facilities and how we approach that. Rather than incarcerating people, how do you keep people first from going to jail in the first place? And these are just priorities that we need our legislative leaders to help us with, and you as citizens to promote them in your wishes.
Xander Patterson, City Club member. I've heard economists from you all the way to Alan Greenspan say that adequately funding education is maybe the single most important thing we can do for economic development in the long run. But we seem to get stuck on the funding aspect of this. It seems pretty clear that on the federal level, we're not going to see increases in funding for education or any other social services. I'm skeptical that we will on the state level either for quite a while. what can we do? Can we on the local level make up for those cuts in funding without sabotaging our economy in other ways? It seems that our fiscal crisis largely results from big tax cuts that have gone overwhelmingly to a small number of rich people, 40% to 1% on the Bush tax cuts, and to corporations. They pay half as much in Oregon as they did 20 years ago. Can we repeal those tax cuts on the local level with progressive taxation here without risking our economy?
Well, I think, there's some things that you could do at the local level, but I think if you go too local, it can be kind of dangerous in the sense that if Multnomah County has much higher taxes than the surrounding counties, for instance, then you get a sort of competitive dynamic where people want to avoid that, right? So I think at the state level, it's easier to handle some of these fiscal issues than at a very, very local level. And so I think returning more attention to the property tax might be justified. But, I'm an economist, so I'm allowed to say politically unsaleable things,
And there seemed to be a very strong support for the concept that the kicker is a failed system and should be gotten done with. How is that going to happen? Do you folks see any ways that there could really be movement in this direction? And perhaps even should anybody in attending here put some effort into it?
Absolutely. The kicker was instituted in 1979, and we've doled out, about $1.5 billion over that time. And I think what really came to an issue is this past budget period. The biennium ended in June of '05, and we started the new two-year budget period. And at that time, the personal income taxes were not above the forecast, so we had no personal kicker, but we were giving a corporate kicker, a refund to corporations. And I think it just stood in stark contrast to the needs we were seeing through education, through social services, and at the very time we needed these things, we're giving back refunds to possible multi-state corporations, and very questionable whether even the advantage of those kicker refunds going back to these corporations is even used in our state. So I think there's a real chance that in our coming legislative session in '07, that we may see some bills, especially directed towards at least maybe redefining how the kicker is calculated, or whether we should have, especially the corporate kicker or not. So I think there's a real chance this time around to have some real meaningful dialogue in that area, because it causes me no headaches beyond belief. And it's just, in my mind, just a ridiculous, they picked 2% out of the thin air, as far as I can tell. And it really needs to be revamped and changed. We can do a much better job if we're concerned about government spending than trying to do it through a hatchet job of the kicker.
Ray Polani, a City Club member. There was some mention about energy and how it will impact the future. But I haven't heard any mention of a sector of the US and Oregon economy which is particularly weak, and that is alternative transportation. With an ownership of automobiles in this state over the population, I think we should start paying serious attention to that. And my question to you is, how about raising the consciousness on this? Transportation affects everything. All the goods are moved, globally and locally. The rest of the world is much more efficient in the movement of goods and services and people. We are not, and we pay for it. So I would suggest that it's time to pay serious attention to that, and I would suggest that it's time to fund alternative transportation appropriately. For that, I would suggest an increase in the gas tax. We still have the lowest gas tax, probably, of most developed countries. And I suggest also a parking tax, very appropriate. and both taxes open to alternative transportation, not devoted to more roads and more. So my question to you is, how about getting with it?
I might just say that I think we might look to international models more than other states for, you know, inspiration here, because I think Oregon actually is doing a lot better than many states on this front. The bus system is very good, and there's much more bike transportation in this city than you see in many American cities. And so I think the awareness as well as the current state of Oregon is pretty good compared to other states. Compared to other countries, it's another question.
Carol Witherell, City Club member. First, thanks to the whole panel for giving us a much-needed, broader spectrum look at economic prosperity with respect to real people and communities. So thank you for that. So my question is for perhaps for Tom first, and you and your colleagues. How might indexes of economic growth and prosperity include measures of social and environmental capital? For example, the health and well-being of people, communities, and natural resources. If these indexes aren't a serious part of measuring what we call prosperity, then aren't the prospects of mindless and wasteful growth quite serious for our future sustainability?
Well, you know, you're absolutely right. I mean, our biggest, broadest measure, sort of index of economic activity is the gross domestic product. And, you know, when the Valdez spill happened, that helped our measure of activity. We had to clean it all up, and there were jobs created, and it was quite a boon, in a way, for our country in the Alaska area. There's been talk of measures such like you're suggesting, ones where rather than always being positives, maybe there's be some negatives that take away, and if those negatives get too strong, those are signals to us that we need to change what we're doing. There's been attempts in the past of this type of measures. I know that there are some right now. Mary?
Sure. I can speak to that a little bit. I mean, these things take time, but there's certainly action on the international level to replace the way we measure our prosperity and well-being. The UN is out in front on this because they realized their development programs were not creating better lives for people, even if they poured money into places, into big dams or whatever they thought was really going to do it, even if GDP per capita went up. So people have developed new measures. I mentioned earlier the Human Development Index or the Human Well-Being Indices, some of these kinds of things, and they're being increasingly accepted. A guy even got a Nobel Prize, Amartya Sen, recently, for really focusing on people's capabilities and functionings. What can you do? That this is really what we probably care much more about rather than some GDP measure.
Chris Smith, City Club member. My question is going to be about two very local economic trends and maybe how we can couple them to our advantage. The first is that downtown Portland has experienced considerable job loss in the last decade. The second is that your colleague Joe Courtwright has done a lot of great research that shows that not only are young, highly educated people moving to our region, they're moving to our central city. The more educated you are, the more likely you are to live, the closer you live to the center of downtown. How can we take all these wonderful innovators who are moving into our region and have economic policies that will support firm creation and job creation by these folks in the downtown core?
We need a regional economist. Do you want to address that?
Joe Cartwright's done some great work, and pointing out the young and the restless. that are coming into especially the Portland metro area. And Portland's only one of a handful of metropolitan regions that have gained a younger age group. Most of the places are losing that age group. And I think that bodes quite well for Portland, because these are going to be your future leaders. These are the people that have the vitality and vision. And so that's a very positive, I think, viewpoint. The other viewpoint that you had about downtown Portland and jobs, possibly losing offices, moving out of the downtown area to surrounding suburbs to avoid whatever it may be, whether it be a tax or some sort of city planning, zoning laws, restrictions, and so on and so forth. Well, if that scenario is true, then this is what you need to have a dialogue with your elected officials. You've got the positiveness of Portland. It's a draw. It's a wonderful place. I'm hosting a national conference for the 50 states of people that do what I do. And we're getting requests right now for reservations. And undoubtedly, it's going to be almost twice the attendance of any other place that this conference has been at. So, there's a real draw here. And as we can keep that going, I think we'll still do well. I don't see this job loss situation as a horrible aspect. I think we're just evolving as a city, and we'll keep doing so. But you're right, we just have to keep our eye on these things. Not a great answer, but
Steve Shell, member. I'd like to follow up on Carol's natural capital idea. 40 years ago, when I studied economics, we learned that you had people, and you had resources, and you had capital. And you need to look at all three of those. I realize you folks are subject to 8-minute sound bites here, but what happens is you've given us the people side of this. Can you give us the capital side, and can you give us the national resource side? For example, I'm a lawyer. I see my folks moving to Vancouver, and that has an effect on rate of capital formation in Oregon. I see measures like ballot measure 37 that tend to dissipate our capability of preserving the way of life I think most of us treasure. And yet I don't see any comment from the economists on those two major issues. Can you give us any predictions, help, idea about what 2006 and 2007 look like, given the rate of capital formation and given the impact of our decisions on natural resources in Oregon?
we're out of time. And very briefly, I predict those people that moved to Vancouver, they're going to be moving back. There's just sort of a synergism here that's hard to get, even though there's distance. And yes, I avoid an income tax, and I can come over here and shop and avoid a sales tax. That advantage only lasts, I think, so long. You really have to be close to the action. And I really think there's still a vibrant here, even though you want to avoid some of the taxes and so on, inheritance taxes and so on, going over to Washington, sell your business while you're in Washington. I really think that's in my mind, more of a not a exodus that's growing and growing, but I think it's kind of plateauing, and if anything, you may see a reverse of that coming back. In terms of our natural resources, Measure 37, I think, was a reaction to really policies of our land use laws, of policies on metro, and unfortunately, it's sold as what every Oregonian believes in down in their heart. If you see something that you believe is not fair, you got to correct it. Fairness extends beyond everything. And there was a sell job on Measure 37 that it was going to make things finally fair, and Oregonians voted for it, not realizing they were throwing the baby out with the bathwater. So I think we're going. So I think we'll have to see what happens with Measure 37. But hopefully we'll be able to have sort of a controlled resurgence of that, or revisiting of that, depending on what the Supreme Court decides, and we'll have to go from there.
Could I make a brief comment that I think we can overread the shift to Vancouver as a tax avoidance shift? I know that we've lost several teachers from my kids' schools who retired while they could lock in their PERS and went to Washington to teach, where they could earn better money. And I'm a voice in my house, constantly argued against by my husband. Let's move to Vancouver, they're funding the schools. So I'm not sure that it's completely people wanting to run over there and avoid the income tax.
We have time for one more question. Steve?
Steve Novick, City Club member. I agree that we could raise money to buy some cool stuff by reducing military spending and raising taxes on rich people back to Bill Clinton levels, or even the much higher levels that prevailed under that well-known socialist Dwight Eisenhower. But that money would quickly be eaten up by the exponential rise in healthcare costs. And I'm wondering if you guys could help us identify some economists who at a future forum could explain how other countries buy equally good health care for less money.
You've got somebody great right here at Portland State University, Rajiv Sharma, who can talk to you about all the paperwork and duplication that we're doing by cutting in these multiple insurance companies into our healthcare system who aren't adding any healthcare. But I suggest you invite him.
Well, thank you. You can continue this discussion online at the City Club's website, where we have a blog that encourages discussion of these topics. Tom, Kim, Mary, thanks very much for joining us today, and we're adjourned.